There's a distinct moment when someone who once leaned into overthinking, into spiraling emotional patterns, decides they've had enough. It doesn't show up in a storm of rage or loud monologues. It's not dramatic. It's not messy. It arrives in quiet resolve. Something shifts internally, and that shift rearranges everything externally. The person who once tried to heal, explain, fix, and interpret begins walking differently, seeing differently, responding differently. That transformation confuses the one accustomed to avoidance. The individual who relied on being difficult to read, hard to reach, and impossible to pin down suddenly finds their tactics ineffective. What once controlled the dynamic now feels irrelevant. This change happens when the one who feels deeply finally honors that depth instead of sacrificing it. They realize their gift isn't to be diluted for anyone's comfort. Their compassion, once stretched thin across someone else's emotional unavailability, finally returns home. In that homecoming, they access something that doesn't need retaliation or reaction. They become someone who recognizes their own energy as enough. They stop chasing clarity where none exists. They stop translating cold behavior into false warmth. They simply choose not to engage the dance anymore. The person on the other side, once thriving in ambiguity, begins to lose footing. They notice that the eyes once filled with hope are no longer seeking validation. They realize that the ears once desperate for meaning now hear with discernment. They see the face once softened by constant understanding become grounded, unbothered. Still, there's no declaration. No war, no words even. Just presence. A presence so full it leaves no room for manipulation to breathe. This inner quiet, born from healing, is what rattles the one who doesn't deal with their own inner storms. Because this stillness doesn't give them chaos to feed on. There's nothing to disrupt, nothing to twist, no threads to pull. The foundation they once stood on, constructed from guilt, silence, and unpredictability, crumbles when the person they thought they had figured out no longer follows the same script. Suddenly they aren't the center of attention. Their moods don't shape the room. Their absence no longer creates panic. Their patterns, once effective, now feel powerless. What creates this shift isn't effort. It's realization. It's when someone, often worn down by endless second chances, finally notices that their kindness was never mirrored, that their patience was mistaken for passivity, that their desire to understand was exploited for advantage, that their role in the story was always to carry more, bend more, wait more. And when they stop doing all of that, not with anger, but with calm, that calm becomes a mirror that reflects the gaps, the hollowness, the avoidance for what it truly is, fear dressed in detachment, control masked as independence. The individual who dodged vulnerability now finds themselves confronted with a reflection they never wanted to see. And they can't look away. Because this isn't rejection. It's not punishment. It's just someone choosing themselves. Finally, choosing self-trust. Choosing self-respect. Choosing self-awareness. No one is forcing change, but change has arrived. Silently, powerfully, undeniably. There's an unseen strength in someone who knows they could destroy, but chooses not to. Who could retaliate but instead reclaims. Who could shout but instead grows. That strength lives in those who see the cracks, and choose not to fill them anymore. Who hear the excuses and choose not to believe them anymore. Who watch the repeated cycles and choose not to ride them anymore. Their presence, fully intact, becomes the most unexpected rebellion. It disturbs every strategy designed to avoid intimacy, responsibility, truth. It's no longer about fixing anyone else. It's about honoring the self. About rising in awareness so fully that the old games fall away. No longer feeling the need to decode silence, chase ghosts, or rewrite their own boundaries just to stay connected. That self-honoring presence radiates in a way that makes everything superficial shrink. It reveals what has depth and what doesn't. What's genuine and what's performed. What's built on trust and what's built on illusion. And for the one on the other end, the one who held the upper hand in uncertainty, that shift is destabilizing. They were prepared for confrontation. They had defenses ready for conflict. But they were not prepared for detachment rooted in self-love. For someone to say nothing and still walk away with dignity. For someone to withdraw energy, not as a tactic, but as a truth. That truth echoes louder than any argument ever could. And they feel it, deeply. There is no closure required, no explanation owed, no last word needed. Because when you stop feeding dysfunction, it starves. And when dysfunction starves, those who relied on it for dominance become lost. They start looking for what's missing. They may circle back, test waters, attempt to re-enter, but they find the door locked. Not out of bitterness, but out of wisdom. What really breaks the ego isn't being yelled at. It isn't being blamed. It's being invisible to someone who once saw everything. It's being unfelt by someone who once carried your weight. It's realizing you no longer live rent-free in someone's mind. That your absence doesn't create emptiness. It creates space. Space for healing. Space for peace. Space for joy. And that space is sacred. The entire paradigm shifts when someone no longer bases their worth on your treatment of them. When they realize your avoidance isn't a mystery, it's a pattern. When they stop being surprised by the same behavior and start responding differently. That change, that presence grounded in self-knowing, is what disrupts cycles that have gone unchecked for too long. It's a quiet revolution. No fireworks. No spectacle. Just someone finally choosing not to participate in emotional confusion. Someone who no longer entertains excuses wrapped in charm. Someone who walks with so much inner alignment that anything misaligned simply fades. Their inner clarity becomes the standard. Their calm becomes protection. Their awareness becomes their compass. The one who used to feel everything now chooses what to feel. The one who used to absorb now filters. The one who used to stay too long now leaves on time. And that timing, that exit, that grounded presence, it doesn't just shift the dynamic. It dismantles it. Not to hurt, not to win, but to honor truth. And that truth, once lived out loud, has the power to unravel every ego built on avoidance. They pause, uncertain why the rhythm they've always depended on has vanished. Patterns that used to work flawlessly start falling apart, not because they were confronted directly, but because someone simply started observing without participating. There's nothing quite as destabilizing as being witnessed without filters, especially by someone who understands without saying much. That kind of perception doesn't scream, it stares straight through the outer shell into the contradictions hiding underneath. No games, no noise, just unshakable attention. It's one thing to be confronted, it triggers the script. Deflection, defense, deflection again, but to be looked at without accusation, to have someone calmly notice the dodges, the deflections, the masks, that's disorienting. Because the ego, especially one built to shield, isn't prepared for clarity. It's armored against attacks, but completely vulnerable to stillness. Not the passive kind, but a stillness grounded in knowing. This clarity doesn't demand. It simply sees, and what it sees, it doesn't need to fix. It recognizes the armor, understands its roots, but refuses to feed it. Instead, it holds up a mirror, not harshly, not critically, but undeniably. That reflection becomes harder to escape. The tricks, the avoidance, the emotional evasion, they all start feeling smaller under that kind of gaze. Smaller and more obvious. When someone looks directly at the essence without recoiling, without judging, without trying to escape, that's when avoidance begins to unravel. Not from confrontation, from recognition, because being recognized in your rawest form removes the ability to hide. And avoidance thrives in hiding. It depends on distraction, on confusion, on staying a few steps ahead of intimacy. But once someone sees clearly, the dance becomes impossible to maintain. Steps become predictable, movements transparent. The charm that once redirected attention no longer works. The silence that once kept others guessing now reveals more than words ever could. And the most unnerving part, the recognition doesn't come with a demand for change. It simply exists. It doesn't push. It doesn't pull. It just knows. And that knowing can't be shaken. That's what truly disturbs the structure built to dodge exposure. Because as long as there was misunderstanding, there was power. As long as someone else stayed confused, the dynamic stayed intact. But when someone sees clearly and chooses not to play, the power dissolves. This presence, rooted in insight, doesn't seek validation. It's not trying to win. It's not looking for acknowledgement. It just knows what's real. And realness is unbearable to someone who spent years layering themselves with half-truths and emotional armor. Every smile that deflects, every shrug that distances, every pause that hides discomfort, none of it can survive sustained awareness. It's not about exposure in a loud sense. It's about being gently unmasked by someone who has nothing to gain from the unmasking. Someone who simply holds space for truth to appear, and in that space, the truth does appear. Sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once, but it arrives. And when it does, the person who spent a lifetime avoiding vulnerability finds themselves faced with the very thing they thought they had protected themselves against. They begin feeling unsettled, not because they've been harmed, but because they've been understood. And that understanding carries a weight no accusation ever could. It doesn't bruise the surface. It cuts through fog and lands deeper, deeper than distance ever dared go. Suddenly all the mechanisms that once kept them safe start to feel like cages. Even more disarming is that the person doing the seeing isn't trying to break them down. They're not trying to corner them or expose weaknesses. They're simply present, completely unapologetically, unshakably. And that presence becomes unbearable, not because it's loud, but because it's honest. And honesty, when it's quiet, echoes, without saying a word. The quiet awareness starts breaking illusions. Every dodge feels obvious. Every redirection feels hollow. Every evasion gets heavier. The tactics once used to maintain emotional distance begin losing their effectiveness. It becomes clear that the person across from them doesn't just hear their words. They read their silences, their glances, their pauses, and they no longer mistake distance for strength. There's a weight in being seen that deep, a weight avoidance was never built to carry. A weight that doesn't punish but reveals. Because the moment someone understands your deepest fears, without needing to hear them, you start wondering what you've been running from all along. And for the first time, the illusion of control starts to feel flimsy. They become unsure of themselves. Not because they've been challenged, but because they've been met. Fully, completely. And the parts of them that never expected to be met begin to panic. They look for exits, for distractions, for noise. But the person across from them offers none. Just clarity, just depth, just presence. And that presence quietly dismantles the ego, not through conflict, but through compassion. A kind of compassion that refuses to enable, that doesn't bend for comfort, that holds firm, not out of pride, but out of wholeness. Wholeness that can't be shaken by inconsistency or emotional retreat. It's the refusal to pretend that delivers the greatest shock, because so many people have pretended before. Pretended not to notice, pretended not to care, pretended not to need more. But when someone sees everything, and still holds themselves with integrity, that's when the ego has nowhere left to run. This kind of seeing isn't about being better or higher, it's about truth. And truth, when witnessed without filters, shakes foundations, especially foundations built on evasion. The need to stay guarded, to stay separate, to stay detached, those things collapse under the weight of being fully acknowledged. Not judged, not pitied, just acknowledged. And that acknowledgement becomes the very thing that makes the ego shatter, because it was never designed to survive authenticity. It was built for survival, not connection. And connection doesn't ask for survival, it asks for surrender. When someone walks into a space with the ability to see through facades, and doesn't run away, doesn't try to fix, doesn't beg, but simply remains, something sacred happens. The person hiding realizes they're no longer hidden, and in that realization, they start unraveling. Slowly, inevitably, uncontrollably. Because what was once safe is now exposed, and what was once powerful now feels fragile. Not from force, but from presence. A presence that never needed to dominate, only to exist fully, unshaken, unwavering. And that kind of existence causes the unspoken to rise, the unseen to surface, the unacknowledged to break open. In that unraveling, something new begins to stir. An unfamiliar stillness, the kind that doesn't chase clarity or beg for understanding. A quiet, so deliberate it feels deafening. It's not the absence of emotion, but the absence of performance. Nothing remains to prove, no energy left to spend where it's not honored. What's left is a kind of silence that fills entire rooms, not because it's empty, but because it's full of restraint. This is not silence as escape, this is silence as power. For those unaccustomed to self-awareness, that quiet creates discomfort. Not because anything harmful is said, but because nothing needs to be anymore. When communication stops trying to convince, it begins to reveal. The tone changes. The absence of noise becomes the message itself. Words lose their usefulness, because now the presence of someone no longer engaged in the same dynamic tells the entire story. Suddenly, every previous conversation feels different in hindsight. Every ignored text, each delayed response, every vague answer now sits under a spotlight of meaning. What used to be glossed over now burns with clarity, and the one who once held control by dodging accountability now faces something far more difficult than confrontation. They face a void where they once held sway. Silence in this form doesn't beg, it doesn't threaten, it doesn't seek vengeance. It declares. It draws a line not with ink but with absence. It places value not through demand, but through withdrawal. And in doing so it shifts everything. The roles invert. The one who was once uncertain becomes untouchable. The one who manipulated distance begins craving closeness. But that closeness is no longer available. This kind of silence carries memory. It remembers every moment of over-explaining, every instance of shrinking, every time kindness was mistaken for weakness. But rather than throwing those moments back, it releases them. It lets go not with bitterness, but with finality. And in doing so it becomes undeniable. There's nothing left to argue with. Nothing left to distort. The person who once tried to fix, who used words like bridges over wounds, no longer uses anything at all. They simply stand still, and that stillness echoes, not as a vacuum, but as presence. Not as punishment, but as permission to move on, to let go, to rise. For the one receiving that silence, confusion begins to brew. The questions come, but the answers don't. Not because they're being withheld, but because they're no longer necessary. The performance is over, the mask has dropped. And now the truth stands alone, unshielded, unspoken, unmovable. What once required paragraphs now lives inside a single glance. What once demanded confrontation now resolves itself through detachment. There are no monologues, no accusations, no pleas. Just an unshakable peace that speaks volumes. And those volumes weigh heavier than any outburst ever could. When someone once so expressive suddenly chooses calm, it's impossible not to notice. When the rhythm of reaction stops, when the pattern of care dissolves, when the emotional availability vanishes, the shift is unmistakable. It pierces through false narratives. It exposes intentions. It highlights what was taken for granted. And for those who thought they could rely on chaos to remain hidden, this silence feels suffocating, because it's no longer a game, no longer a cycle. It's an end that doesn't announce itself, yet final all the same. No grand finale. No curtain call, just a closed door, gently but firmly locked. In that door closing, something deeper unfolds. A realization that what was once tolerated will never be again. That emotional labor once freely offered has expired. That the person who once stayed too long has learned the art of walking away quietly. And that lesson, the one not taught with words, but with distance, is impossible to forget. Silence, when born from self-worth, doesn't just end conversations, it ends illusions. It reveals intentions, it separates truth from comfort, and it compels reflection, not because it demands it, but because it creates space for it. That space becomes a mirror, not of someone else's opinion, but of your own behavior. And that mirror doesn't lie. So while accusations may spark defenses, silence disarms them. While shouting may provoke resistance, quiet presence bypasses it. The mind can debate words, but not emptiness. The heart can deny confrontation, but not abandonment. And that abandonment, when it's self-chosen by someone who once gave everything, is the most haunting sound of all. This absence, this refusal to engage, doesn't come from weakness. It comes from having finally seen enough. From understanding that explanations don't heal when they're dismissed. That love doesn't thrive when only one person is present. That connection doesn't survive where safety doesn't exist. So the empath stops giving, not because they stopped caring, but because they started valuing. Not because they ran out of emotion, but because they found self-preservation. Their silence isn't the result of suppression. It's the arrival of wisdom. Wisdom that says energy must be honored. Wisdom that whispers peace is worth protecting, and protect it they do. Not by building walls, but by creating boundaries. Not through resistance, but through redirection. They don't attack, they ascend. They don't retaliate, they release. And that release, invisible to the eye, transforms everything it touches. What once demanded effort now flows without it. What once consumed thought now holds no weight. The emotional investments once poured into fixing now return to the source. And that return rebuilds something far more powerful than any apology ever could: sovereignty. Sovereignty doesn't shout, it simply exists. It walks away from chaos without leaving traces. It doesn't need explanations, it knows its value. And when someone knows their value, their silence becomes sacred, unapproachable, inviolable. The one left behind may not understand immediately, but they feel it. Not just in words left unsaid, but in energy no longer given, in care no longer shown, in time no longer offered. That absence becomes a presence they can't unfeel. It haunts not because of cruelty, but because of truth. The truth that someone once available in every way now lives free from dependence, and that freedom, its silence is louder than any closing argument ever written. There's no going back. Not because doors are slammed, but because the path has shifted. The one who once fought to be understood now understands themselves. And from that understanding comes detachment, not bitter, not cold, just whole. And wholeness has no need to scream. Wholeness does not beg. Wholeness walks even when no one watches. Wholeness chooses the quiet path, because it knows that the loudest statements are often made without a sound. And when that steady forward motion continues without looking over the shoulder, it reveals something no one ever expected to confront: an internal hollowness previously camouflaged by routine evasion. It's not immediately visible to the individual who once thrived in distance and ambiguity, but it grows louder with every unmet expectation, every unreciprocated pull, every door that no longer swings open on cue. What used to feel like independence starts resembling isolation. Not because someone inflicted harm, but because they chose to no longer absorb what wasn't theirs. Boundaries don't scream, they don't chase, they don't accuse, they simply remain firm, unmoved, unmistakable. And in that steadiness, the person accustomed to subtle control and emotional withdrawal is forced to confront what's been hiding beneath every disappearing act. The absence of pursuit doesn't create comfort. It leaves a vacancy where manipulation once lived. And in that vacancy, something unfamiliar emerges: reflection. For the one avoiding connection, this reflection isn't kind. It doesn't flatter. It doesn't soften. It tells the truth in sharp detail. All the evaded conversations, the delayed decisions, the strategic distance, they echo now, not through someone else's voice but in the form of consequences. Not receiving the same warmth they once relied upon reveals what was never developed inside them: consistency, responsibility, courage. The wall they believed would shield them now blocks nourishment. The silence they used to control situations now invites questions they can't answer. They wonder why things feel different, but deep down they already understand. That understanding doesn't show up as language. It appears as weight in the chest, tightness in the throat, unrest in the quiet hours. The one who always adjusted, gave extra space, offered patience beyond reason, they've shifted. Not out of anger, but realization. They no longer mold themselves to fit emotional limitations. They no longer interpret silence as mystery. Instead, they honor what they feel without expecting it to be returned. That self-respect becomes an invisible wall, one that isn't meant to punish, only to protect. In facing this new reality, the avoidant must acknowledge the discrepancy, not between two people, but within themselves. They were never required to give more because someone else always gave first. But now, faced with a refusal to bend, they come up against their own inability to stretch, and that recognition burns. This isn't about blame, it's about truth. And truth, when untouched by compromise, reveals all the cracks, not to shame, but to illuminate. Those cracks weren't caused by others, they existed long before, but now for the first time there's no one to blame them on, no one to soothe them, no one to explain them away. Just a person standing alone, looking directly into the place where connection should have been, and realizing it's empty. The contrast is what stings. The one who once remained available, emotionally fluent, vulnerable, they created balance even when the scales tilted unfairly, but they've stepped back. Their hand no longer extends by default. Their tone no longer carries softness, just to maintain peace. Their presence no longer cushions discomfort, and suddenly emotional withdrawal feels less like power, and more like disconnection. Without someone to overfunction, underfunctioning becomes obvious, and that imbalance, once camouflaged by excuses and shifting blame, now sits exposed. Where there was once noise to cover avoidance, there is now quiet, not peaceful quiet, reflective quiet. The kind that forces awareness. That awareness doesn't scream either, but it does persist. Every missed moment comes into view, every failed reply, every broken promise, every dodge, all replay, not as guilt trips, but as unfiltered truth, and the echo is loud. The one who never had to explain now explains to themselves. They start wondering if what they lost was irreplaceable, and worse, they begin to suspect that it was. Regret grows in silence, not because someone demands it but because reality leaves no room for denial. The consistency they dismissed becomes more visible in its absence. The care they once received feels different now that it's no longer there. The emotional generosity they once relied on feels like a ghost, always remembered, no longer accessible. And within this absence they begin to question, not what went wrong, but why they didn't show up. Why they felt the need to distance. Why they misread patience as permanence. Why they never built the muscles necessary to reciprocate depth. Those questions hurt more than confrontation ever could, because they can't be deflected. The hardest truth isn't that someone left, it's that the dynamic ended, because it was one-sided. And no matter how much someone may try to rewrite that, the evidence remains: they were seen, accepted, even loved, but not met. And now they're not invited back into a space that once held them with care. That space, protected by boundaries, becomes sacred. Not because it excludes, but because it preserves. No one gets to walk through it without matching the integrity it holds. That standard, once negotiable, is now fixed. And the one who couldn't meet it begins to understand what that means, not intellectually, but viscerally. They start imagining what it would have felt like to show up differently, to have stayed instead of disappearing, to have spoken instead of deflecting, to have chosen closeness over strategy. But imagination doesn't undo reality, it only illuminates possibility lost, and the weight of that loss becomes heavier with time. Still, there's no drama, no chaos, just a door that no longer opens, and a person who no longer knocks. That image, for the avoidant, remains etched. Not because they were rejected, but because they were unready. Not because they were unloved, but because they were unchanged. And now, what they see is not anger, but standards. Not coldness, but self-awareness. Not punishment, but transformation. They see someone they once thought they understood become someone they no longer recognize. Not because they've become distant, but because they've become whole. That wholeness, once invisible under layers of giving, now shines in silence. It doesn't reach, it doesn't repeat, it doesn't explain, it simply is. And that being speaks louder than anything ever spoken. It stands still and sure as a mirror that shows not what was done to them, but what they failed to become. A mirror not cracked by blame, but polished by growth. And what it reflects is undeniable, not through emotion, but through absence. And that absence doesn't ask for anything. It requires nothing, it just reminds. Not through memory, but through reflection. A reflection they now carry, whether they want to or not. A reflection that follows them, not as punishment, but as truth. And in that truth, something begins. Not a chase, not a plea, but a possibility. A possibility that maybe, just maybe, the only way forward is through everything they once avoided.